The moment my wife praised another man in front of my parents, I realized dinner was no longer just dinner. It was a quiet evening in our suburban home in Westchester, and I had convinced myself it would be simple, normal, forgettable. My father, Robert Turner, sat at the dining table with the calm expression of a man who missed nothing, not even silence. Across from him, Olivia Turner was already talking about her boss, Richard Hayes, as if he were the center of every success she had ever known. I stayed quiet, holding my fork a little tighter, pretending not to notice how her words kept pushing me further out of my own life. My mother was setting the table in the kitchen, but my father's eyes never left Olivia, as if he was already measuring something unspoken. She laughed softly as she described Richard Hayes leading meetings, closing deals, and building a career she clearly admired more than she realized. Each word felt careful, like it was placed there on purpose, and I started to wonder if I had become background noise in my own marriage. Then my father finally spoke, his voice calm, asking only what seemed like a simple question about the kind of work Richard actually did. Olivia lit up instantly, describing him with a pride that made it sound like she was talking about someone far above all of us. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, but from the quiet realization that no one at that table was actually looking at me anymore. My father, however, didn't react the way I expected. Instead, he looked at me for a long second, as if waiting for something I hadn't said. And in that silence, I realized this dinner wasn't about introductions at all, but about something none of us were ready to name yet. The chandelier above us cast a warm glow across the table, but it felt strangely colder the longer Olivia kept speaking. I remembered when we first met, when she used to ask me about my day instead of describing someone else's success. Richard Hayes, according to her, wasn't just her boss, he was a standard she measured everything against. My father set down his glass slowly, as if weighing every word he had heard so far. Olivia didn't notice the shift at the table. She was too focused on how impressive Richard sounded in her story. And I sat there wondering when admiration turned into something that made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. My father finally leaned back, looked at Olivia, and asked the one question that changed the entire tone of the night. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but somehow it made everyone at the table stop breathing for just a moment, including me. Because in that instant, I realized my father wasn't reacting to my wife's words, he was evaluating the entire structure of our lives in a way none of us understood yet. The room stayed quiet after my father's question, but it was not the kind of quiet that feels empty, it was the kind that feels measured, like someone had just placed a scale in the middle of the table and everyone was waiting to see what would tip first. Olivia did not seem to notice it at all. She smiled, leaned slightly forward, and continued talking about Richard Hayes as if the conversation had naturally evolved into something meant to impress rather than inform. She described him as decisive, influential, and always in control of every situation he entered, and with each word I felt the distance between us quietly expand without anyone acknowledging it out loud. My mother glanced at me once, then quickly looked away, as if unsure whether she was witnessing something she was allowed to comment on. My father, however, remained focused on Olivia, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharper than before. He asked another question, still calm, asking what kind of results Richard actually produced in his work, not his personality, not his presence, but measurable outcomes. Olivia hesitated for the first time, just for a fraction of a second, before responding with general praise that sounded confident but lacked detail. She said he led important teams and made things happen that others could not, but she did not explain what those things were, and I noticed that silence more than I noticed her words. My father nodded slowly, as if confirming something only he could see, then leaned back in his chair without breaking eye contact with her. I felt my stomach tighten because I had seen that expression before, the one he used when something did not add up but he was not ready to explain why. Olivia continued speaking, now more relaxed again, as if she had passed the test she did not know she was taking. She mentioned how working under Richard made her feel challenged in a way she had never experienced before, and she said it with admiration that felt almost rehearsed, like she had repeated it in her mind too many times. I sat there listening, realizing I had stopped being part of the conversation entirely, even though I was still physically sitting at the same table. My father finally picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and asked if Richard had ever built anything himself, or if he only managed what others created. The question landed differently this time, heavier, sharper, and Olivia's smile flickered for just a moment before she answered again, but this time less certain. I could feel the shift now, subtle but real, like the foundation beneath the conversation was beginning to show cracks no one wanted to acknowledge. My father did not raise his voice, he did not challenge her directly, he simply observed her reaction with the patience of someone collecting information rather than participating in debate. And in that quiet exchange, I began to understand that this dinner was no longer about introductions or polite conversation, but about value, perception, and the invisible hierarchy we all assume without ever questioning it. Richard Hayes had become the center of Olivia's admiration, but my father was no longer looking at Richard, he was looking at how easily that admiration had been formed, and what it said about everything else sitting at this table. The conversation at the table began to feel less like casual dinner talk and more like a quiet evaluation neither Olivia nor I had agreed to participate in. My father's questions had not changed in tone, but they had changed in direction, slowly narrowing in on the substance behind everything Olivia was saying about Richard Hayes. She continued describing him, but now her words carried a slight adjustment, as if she was aware that admiration alone was no longer enough to satisfy the curiosity across the table. My father asked whether Richard was someone who created systems or simply operated within them, and Olivia paused just long enough for the silence to become noticeable before answering that he was more of a leader than a builder, though she did not sound as certain as she had earlier. I noticed how she began to choose her words more carefully, as if she was suddenly aware that she was being asked to define something she had only ever described emotionally. My mother cleared her throat softly, trying to ease the tension by asking Olivia how long she had worked under Richard, and Olivia responded quickly, almost too quickly, saying it had been long enough to understand his impact on the company. But even as she spoke, I could hear a shift in her confidence, a subtle hesitation that had not been there before. My father set his glass down again, not sharply, but with deliberate control, and asked if Richard had ever taken responsibility for something that had gone wrong under his leadership. The question was simple, but it changed the energy in the room in a way that felt immediate and unavoidable. Olivia blinked once, then smiled slightly, as if trying to maintain the image she had already built, and said that in every organization there were challenges, but Richard always handled them professionally. That answer should have sounded complete, but instead it felt carefully incomplete, like something shaped to avoid direct exposure. I stayed quiet, but inside I began noticing things I had ignored before, moments where Olivia spoke about Richard with admiration that did not quite connect to specifics, moments where her certainty seemed more emotional than factual. My father leaned back again, his expression unchanged, but his eyes now carried a kind of quiet focus that made it clear he was no longer listening to praise but analyzing structure. He asked one more question, this time softer, asking whether Richard's role had changed significantly in the last few years or whether he had always been in a position of authority. Olivia hesitated longer this time, and I saw her glance briefly at me before answering, as if searching for something stable in the room to anchor her response. She said he had grown quickly within the company, faster than most people expected, and she added that talent like his could not be easily defined. But as soon as she finished speaking, there was a pause that no one rushed to fill, and in that pause I realized something unsettling had begun to take shape beneath the surface of the conversation. My father was no longer just asking about Richard Hayes, he was testing the consistency of the story Olivia believed she was telling, and I could feel the direction of the evening shifting towards something none of us had prepared for. The silence that followed Olivia's last sentence did not feel accidental anymore, it felt structured, as if the room itself had begun to organize around something none of us had fully recognized yet. My father did not react immediately, and that absence of reaction was beginning to feel more powerful than any response he could have made. Olivia, however, seemed unaware of the shift. She continued speaking about Richard Hayes with a kind of steady admiration that now felt less like enthusiasm and more like repetition, as if she had said these things before in different rooms and different conversations. I noticed how she avoided specifics whenever my father asked for them, always returning to general statements about leadership, vision, and impact without ever grounding them in measurable detail. My mother had stopped trying to smooth the conversation, her hands resting quietly near her plate as she watched the exchange unfold with growing uncertainty. I found myself focusing less on what Olivia was saying and more on how she was saying it, because the pattern had started to reveal itself in a way I could no longer ignore. Every time my father pressed for clarity, Olivia responded with admiration instead of evidence, and every time she did, the gap between perception and reality widened just a little more. My father finally leaned forward again, folding his hands together on the table, and asked something that changed the rhythm of the entire evening. He asked whether Richard Hayes had ever been responsible for a major decision that directly affected Olivia's career trajectory. The question was simple, but it carried weight because it required a concrete memory, not an impression. Olivia paused longer this time, her eyes briefly shifting downward before she answered that Richard had been the one who recognized her potential early and placed her in positions where she could grow. There was confidence in her voice, but it was no longer effortless, it felt assembled. I could feel my own thoughts beginning to reorganize as well, because for the first time I started to see the shape of something underneath her admiration that might not be as stable as it appeared. My father nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer, and then asked if anyone else at the company had made similar claims about Richard's influence, or if it was something Olivia experienced personally. That question landed differently. It did not challenge her directly, but it separated experience from belief in a way that made Olivia hesitate again. She looked at him, then at me, as if searching for alignment or support, but I remained silent because I no longer knew where the conversation was heading. She finally said that everyone respected Richard, and that respect alone was enough to understand his position within the company. My father did not respond right away, and in that pause I noticed something I had not seen before, a subtle narrowing of his attention, as if he was no longer listening to words but to structure itself. He finally spoke again, softly, almost casually, and said that respect without definition often meant different things to different people. Olivia stopped speaking after that, not because she was told to, but because there was nothing left to confidently add. And in that moment, I realized the conversation had stopped being about Richard Hayes entirely, and had become about the difference between what we believe about people and what can actually be proven about them. The moment my father stopped speaking, the entire room seemed to adjust itself around his silence, as if even the air was waiting to see whether he would continue or leave the thought unfinished. Olivia looked relieved at first, mistaking the pause for the end of questioning, and she shifted slightly in her chair as if the conversation was returning to safe ground. But my father did not move away from the subject, he simply changed how he approached it, and that change was subtle enough that only someone paying close attention would notice it. He looked at Olivia again, not with challenge, but with a kind of quiet certainty that suggested he had already begun forming conclusions long before any of us realized it. He asked, in an almost conversational tone, whether Richard Hayes had ever held a similar position at another company before this one, or whether his rise had been contained entirely within a single environment. Olivia hesitated, and this time the hesitation was not small. It was noticeable enough that even my mother stopped moving her hands near her plate. Olivia responded that Richard had always been with the same organization, and that his growth there was what made him exceptional. She said it with confidence, but something about the rhythm of her words felt less like explanation and more like reinforcement, as if she was reminding herself rather than informing us. My father nodded slowly, and for the first time that evening, he looked away from Olivia and briefly toward me, not as if seeking permission, but as if confirming something internally. I felt an uncomfortable awareness settle in my chest because I realized I had stopped defending anything in my mind. I was simply observing. My father then asked another question, softer again, asking whether Olivia had ever personally worked under Richard on a project from beginning to end, or whether her experience was based on interactions within a larger team structure. Olivia paused longer this time, her eyes shifting slightly as she searched for the right way to frame her answer without weakening her earlier statements. She finally said that most of her experience came from seeing how Richard guided teams rather than working directly under him in a strict reporting line. The answer should have sounded normal, but instead it created a gap, a space between admiration and direct experience that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. I noticed my father's expression change just slightly, not in emotion, but in clarity, as if a final piece had aligned with something he had been considering all evening. He leaned back again and said nothing for a moment, letting the silence settle in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Olivia, now sensing something unfamiliar in the atmosphere, attempted to lighten the moment by saying that regardless of structure or hierarchy, Richard's presence alone had been transformative for everyone around him. But even as she said it, I could hear a shift in her tone, a slight reduction in certainty that had not been there before. My father finally spoke again, not directly addressing her words, but instead making a quiet observation that people often confuse proximity with influence, and visibility with actual impact. No one responded immediately, because the statement was not framed as an argument, it was framed as an observation that did not require agreement. I found myself replaying everything Olivia had said from the beginning of dinner, and for the first time I started noticing how much of it was built on perception rather than detail. My father looked down briefly at his hands, then back up at the table, and the atmosphere shifted again, not loudly, but unmistakably, as if something foundational had just been repositioned without any visible movement. And in that silence, I began to understand that whatever my father was doing, it was no longer about Richard Hayes at all. It was about how easily a story could feel complete even when the structure underneath it was still missing key pieces. The silence after my father's last observation did not feel like an ending, it felt like a transition, as if the room had quietly moved from conversation into evaluation without informing anyone. Olivia sat straighter now, but not with confidence, more with the kind of posture people use when they begin to sense they are being measured in ways they did not anticipate. My mother glanced between all of us, clearly aware that the tone of the dinner had shifted into something unfamiliar, something that no longer belonged to polite family conversation. My father, however, remained steady, his attention no longer chasing Olivia's words but instead focusing on the structure behind them, as if he was mapping patterns only he could see. He finally broke the silence by asking a question that seemed simple on the surface, asking whether Richard Hayes had ever been responsible for managing outcomes that required accountability beyond recognition or praise. Olivia hesitated again, but this time the hesitation carried weight, like she was no longer retrieving information but constructing an answer that would survive scrutiny. She said that Richard was respected for his ability to guide teams through difficult transitions, but she avoided any direct mention of responsibility for failure or correction of mistakes. I noticed how carefully she was now choosing her phrases, as if every word had become something that could be tested rather than accepted. My father nodded once, slowly, and I could tell that the answer had not surprised him, but it had confirmed something he was already leaning toward understanding. He leaned forward slightly and asked whether Richard's influence was ever formally documented in performance reviews or whether it was something expressed informally through reputation. Olivia's expression tightened for just a moment before she responded that much of Richard's impact was understood through how people felt working with him rather than through formal metrics. That sentence lingered in the air longer than anything else she had said all evening, because it revealed more than she intended. My father did not respond immediately, and in that pause I felt an uncomfortable awareness growing in me, not of Olivia, but of how easily language could replace structure when people wanted something to feel more significant than it might actually be. My father finally spoke again, not with challenge, but with quiet certainty, saying that when influence cannot be clearly measured, it often depends on perception rather than contribution. Olivia shifted slightly in her seat, her confidence now visibly thinner than it had been at the beginning of dinner. She tried to return to her earlier tone, saying that Richard inspired people in ways that numbers could not always capture, but her voice no longer carried the same certainty. I found myself watching her more closely now, noticing how her admiration had not changed, but how it was no longer anchored in anything specific enough to hold its original weight. My father looked down at the table briefly, then back up, and I realized he was no longer testing Richard at all. He was testing the consistency of belief itself, how it forms, how it spreads, and how quickly it can replace actual evidence when it is never challenged. And sitting there, I began to understand that this dinner had shifted into something far more precise than I had first assumed, because what was being revealed was not about one man's career or another man's role, but about how fragile certainty becomes when it is built entirely on stories that have never been examined closely enough to withstand simple questions. The atmosphere at the table had shifted into something that no longer depended on Olivia's confidence, or my silence. It now seemed to orbit entirely around my father's calm precision, as if he had quietly taken control of the rhythm of the conversation without ever announcing it. Olivia was still speaking, but her words no longer carried the same weight they had at the beginning of dinner, because every new statement now seemed to be filtered through a growing sense of uncertainty. My mother had stopped trying to intervene altogether, her attention fixed on the subtle tension unfolding between all of us, as if she understood that anything she said might disrupt something she could not yet identify. My father, however, remained composed, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, and his questions now arriving with even greater simplicity than before. He asked whether Richard Hayes had ever directly trained or mentored Olivia in a formal capacity, or whether their interaction had always been indirect through organizational structure. Olivia hesitated, and this time the hesitation was longer, not just a pause in speech but a pause in certainty itself. She eventually said that Richard was not a direct mentor in the traditional sense, but that his influence was always present in the decisions she made and the direction she followed within the company. As she spoke, I noticed something I had not seen earlier in the evening, a slight tightening in her expression, as if she was beginning to realize that her own descriptions were becoming harder to sustain under continuous clarification. My father nodded slowly again, but this time he did not immediately follow up with another question. Instead, he allowed the silence to expand, and in that expansion, something changed in the way Olivia carried herself. She attempted to continue, saying that leadership does not always require direct involvement to have impact. But her voice no longer carried the same natural certainty. It sounded increasingly like explanation rather than conviction. I found myself paying attention not only to what was being said, but to what was no longer being said, because every answer now seemed to leave something important just outside of reach. My father finally spoke again, but instead of asking about Richard, he shifted the focus in a way that felt subtle but decisive, asking Olivia how she personally defined success in her role and whether that definition had changed over time. The question caught her slightly off guard, and for the first time she seemed to step away from Richard entirely in her response. She spoke about growth, responsibility, and recognition, but her words felt broader now, less anchored to a specific person and more to general professional ideals. I realized that the conversation had quietly moved away from admiration and towards self-definition, and that shift created a different kind of pressure at the table, one that was harder to resist because it no longer depended on defending someone else. My father listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting, only absorbing each part of her answer as if comparing it against something internal. When she finished speaking, he gave a small nod, not of agreement or disagreement, but of acknowledgement, and then he looked briefly at me again before returning his attention to Olivia. And in that brief moment, I understood that whatever conclusion he was forming had very little to do with what was being said out loud, and much more to do with what had remained unsaid since the very beginning of dinner. The dinner table had reached a point where no one was speaking just to fill silence anymore. Every word now carried weight, and even the smallest pause felt like it had meaning attached to it. Olivia sat with her hands resting near her plate, her earlier confidence now replaced with something more measured, as if she was carefully choosing not just what to say, but how much of herself to reveal in the process. My mother remained quiet, her attention moving between all of us with the awareness that something important was unfolding even if she could not yet define what it was. My father, however, stayed exactly as he had been all evening, calm, steady, and observant, but now there was something different in the way he looked at Olivia, as if the information he needed was no longer coming from direct answers but from patterns forming across everything she had already said. He leaned slightly forward and asked her a final question, not about Richard Hayes anymore, not about titles or influence or structure, but about something more personal, asking what she believed truly defined value in a person she worked with every day. The question was simple, but it shifted the entire atmosphere of the room because it was no longer about someone else, it was about her judgment itself. Olivia took a moment before answering, and when she did, she spoke about consistency, confidence, and the ability to inspire others through presence rather than instruction. Her words were steady, but I noticed that she was no longer referencing Richard directly, as if she had unconsciously stepped away from him in order to answer something more abstract. My father listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in him that suggested he had reached the point of confirmation rather than inquiry. He nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought he might end the conversation there, but instead he asked something even simpler, asking whether she believed influence was something a person earned or something that others projected onto them over time. Olivia hesitated again, longer than before, and this time the silence was not just in the room, it felt like it settled inside her answer before she could fully form it. When she finally responded, she said it was probably a combination of both, but her voice carried less certainty than anything she had said all evening. My father leaned back slightly, as if accepting that answer not as truth, but as the final piece of a structure he had been examining from the beginning. He looked at Olivia for a long moment without speaking, and in that silence I could feel the entire dynamic of the dinner shift again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt irreversible. Then he finally spoke, not to challenge her, not to correct her, but to observe aloud that when people build an understanding of someone they do not fully know, they often end up defending a version of that person that only exists in their own perception. Olivia did not respond immediately, and for the first time since the conversation had begun, she seemed unsure whether she should. I sat there realizing that nothing my father had said all evening was actually about Richard Hayes in isolation. It had all been about how easily certainty can form without foundation, and how difficult it becomes to recognize when admiration is built more on distance than on truth. And as the room remained quiet, I began to understand that whatever conclusion my father had reached was not going to be announced through confrontation, but through the slow collapse of assumptions none of us had realized we were still holding on to. The silence that followed my father's last observation did not end the conversation, it changed its purpose. It was no longer about answers or explanations, it had become about what could survive when every explanation was slowly stripped of certainty. Olivia looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up, as if trying to regain the sense of control she had carried into dinner, but something about the room no longer responded to that effort. My mother remained still, her expression now more concerned than curious, sensing that whatever direction this had taken was not something she could easily interrupt. I sat there quietly, aware that I was no longer being asked to participate in the conversation, only to witness it. My father finally broke the silence again, but not with another question this time. Instead, he spoke in a calm, reflective tone, saying that most people do not evaluate others based on direct experience, but rather on the version of those people that is most frequently repeated within their environment. Olivia listened without responding, and I noticed that for the first time she did not immediately attempt to fill the silence afterward. My father continued, saying that over time, repetition can begin to feel like evidence, even when no direct verification exists, and that is where perception often replaces understanding without anyone noticing the transition. Olivia shifted slightly in her seat, her earlier certainty now replaced by a quieter, more internal focus, as if she was no longer defending Richard Hayes but reconsidering how she had come to define him in the first place. I realized then that the conversation had moved away from any single individual and had become something far more uncomfortable, because it was now touching the way all of us construct meaning around the people we trust to define success, influence, and authority. My father looked at Olivia again and said something simple, that influence does not need constant validation when it is real, but when it depends on constant reinforcement, it may not be as stable as it appears. No one responded immediately, because there was nothing in that statement that required agreement or disagreement. It simply existed in the room as a conclusion formed through observation rather than argument. Olivia finally spoke again, but her voice was softer now, less certain, saying that she had never thought about it in those terms before, and that most of what she knew about Richard came from shared experiences rather than direct evaluation. As she said it, I could sense a subtle shift, as if she was beginning to hear her own words differently than she had intended them. My father nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the pattern he had been observing was now complete enough to stand on its own. He did not press further, he did not need to, because the structure of the conversation had already revealed more than any additional question could extract. I found myself thinking back through everything Olivia had said since the beginning of dinner, and for the first time I could see how easily admiration, repetition, and proximity could form a complete image of someone without requiring actual depth beneath it. The room felt quieter now, not because less was being said, but because everything that needed to be said had already shifted into understanding rather than expression. My father finally leaned back in his chair, and in that small movement I sensed the end of his analysis, not because anything had been proven definitively, but because the illusion of certainty had already begun to loosen. And as I sat there watching Olivia process the weight of that realization in her own way, I understood that the real subject of the evening had never been Richard Hayes at all, but the fragile architecture of belief that allows people to accept a version of reality simply because it has been repeated often enough to feel complete. The room felt different after my father leaned back, as if something invisible had settled into place, and no one was entirely sure whether it was final or still unfolding. Olivia remained quiet longer than she had all evening, her eyes lowered slightly, no longer actively shaping her responses but instead sitting with them as if they had begun to weigh differently inside her own mind. My mother glanced toward me briefly, then back at the table, as though searching for a version of the conversation that felt familiar enough to re-enter safely, but nothing about the atmosphere offered that comfort anymore. My father, however, did not appear tense or concerned, only resolved in a quiet way that suggested he had already reached the end of what he needed to understand. After a few moments, he spoke again, but this time his tone shifted away from questioning and into reflection, saying that in his experience people often confuse repeated exposure with verified competence, especially in structured environments where hierarchy can blur the source of actual results. Olivia looked up slightly at that, but did not interrupt, and I noticed that she was no longer defending Richard in the way she had been earlier, she was simply listening. My father continued, saying that in many organizations, visibility often gets mistaken for contribution, and the person most frequently mentioned becomes the person most frequently assumed to be responsible for success, even when the underlying work may be distributed across many others. There was no accusation in his voice, only observation, but the effect of his words lingered in a way that made the table feel even smaller. He then turned his attention back to Olivia and asked her something simple again, asking her to describe one specific decision Richard Hayes had made in the past year that directly changed an outcome she could clearly identify. The question was so direct that it removed all space for interpretation, and for the first time Olivia did not respond immediately. She paused, then shifted slightly in her chair, and when she finally spoke, her answer was slower, less structured, explaining that Richard often guided direction rather than making isolated decisions that could be traced to a single outcome. As she spoke, I could feel the difference between explanation and evidence widening again, but this time even she seemed aware of it. My father nodded once, then said calmly that guidance without traceable impact often becomes difficult to separate from perception, because it exists more in influence than in measurable result. The words were not sharp, but they settled heavily because they were final in tone, even if they were not presented as judgment. Olivia did not respond after that, and the silence that followed felt deeper than earlier pauses because it no longer felt like anticipation, it felt like conclusion. I found myself looking at Olivia differently now, not with judgment, but with the realization that she had built a complete understanding of someone through fragments that had never been challenged until this moment. My father finally looked around the table once, then briefly at me, and I could see that whatever he had been evaluating was no longer external. It was structural, almost philosophical in nature, about how people construct certainty from incomplete information and defend it until it is gently removed by something as simple as a precise question. And as I sat there in the quiet that followed, I understood that the real shift had already happened without anyone announcing it, because what had begun as a conversation about a person at work had slowly turned into a revelation about how easily all of us mistake familiarity for truth, and how fragile that certainty becomes the moment it is asked to stand without assumption. The silence at the table no longer felt like something waiting to be filled, it felt like something that had already completed its purpose. Olivia sat still, her gaze lowered for a few seconds longer than before, as if she was no longer responding to the conversation but instead processing everything that had already been said. My mother finally exhaled softly, the kind of breath that comes when tension has been held too long without resolution, but she still did not speak. My father, however, remained composed in the same way he had been all evening, but there was a subtle shift now, not in attention, but in finality, as if the internal evaluation he had been conducting had reached its conclusion. He did not add another question, he did not extend the discussion further, instead he simply looked at Olivia for a brief moment, and then allowed his gaze to settle back on the table. That small movement felt more decisive than anything he had said earlier. Olivia seemed to sense it as well, because she adjusted slightly in her chair, her expression no longer focused on defending or explaining, but on absorbing what had just been left unspoken. I realized that the energy at the table had changed from examination to reflection, as if every participant now understood that nothing further was required to be proven in this moment. My father finally broke the silence again, but this time his words were not directed at Olivia, they were broader, more reflective, saying that people often build certainty not from direct knowledge, but from the consistency of what they are repeatedly shown over time. He said it calmly, without emphasis, but the meaning carried through the room clearly enough that no one needed clarification. Olivia did not respond immediately, and when she finally did, her voice was quieter than before, acknowledging that much of what she understood about Richard Hayes had come from observation and shared perception rather than direct evaluation of his decisions. As she said it, I noticed that she no longer sounded defensive, she sounded aware, as if she was hearing her own explanation from a slightly different distance. My father nodded once, slowly, not as agreement or disagreement, but as acknowledgement that the pattern he had been observing was now fully visible. The conversation did not continue after that in any meaningful direction, instead it began to dissolve into silence that felt more intentional than accidental. I found myself no longer focused on Richard Hayes or even on Olivia's perception of him, but on the structure of how easily a narrative can form within an environment where information is partial and repetition is strong enough to replace verification. My father leaned back slightly again, his posture unchanged, but his attention no longer searching for anything additional, as if what he needed to understand had already been established through the exchange itself. Olivia remained quiet, not because she was being silenced, but because there was nothing left in the framework of the conversation that required her to defend or redefine anything further. And as I sat there watching the final moments of that exchange settle into stillness, I understood that the real outcome of the evening was not about proving or disproving any individual, but about recognizing how quickly certainty can dissolve when it is separated from direct experience, and how fragile perception becomes when it is asked to stand on its own without repetition to support it. The moment of silence at the table did not break, it simply changed form, becoming something quieter but far more definitive, as if the conversation had naturally reached its final layer without anyone needing to announce it. Olivia remained still for a moment longer, her hands resting near her plate, no longer speaking because there was nothing left in her mind that felt necessary to defend or explain. My mother looked between us carefully, her expression softening slightly now that the tension had begun to dissolve, but she still did not attempt to speak, as if she understood that any interruption would feel unnecessary at this point. My father, however, had shifted into a state of complete stillness, not disengaged, but fully settled, as if he had reached the end of a process that had been unfolding silently throughout the entire evening. He finally leaned forward just slightly and said something calm and simple, not directed at anyone in particular, stating that most misunderstandings in judgment do not come from lack of intelligence, but from incomplete exposure to the full structure of a situation. The words were not presented as criticism, but as conclusion, and that distinction changed how they landed in the room. Olivia listened without responding, and for the first time since dinner began, she did not attempt to reinterpret or reframe anything that had been said. I noticed that she seemed more introspective now, as if the weight of the conversation had shifted inward rather than outward. My father continued, still in the same calm tone, saying that when people rely on consistent narrative rather than direct verification, they often build confidence in conclusions that feel accurate but remain untested. He did not elaborate further, and he did not need to, because the point had already been made in the structure of everything that came before it. There was a long pause after that, one that did not feel uncomfortable anymore, only final in a quiet way. Olivia eventually spoke, her voice softer than before, acknowledging that much of what she had understood about Richard Hayes had been shaped more by perception and repeated context than by direct evaluation of his actual decisions or measurable outcomes. As she said it, there was no resistance in her tone, only recognition, as if she was seeing her own understanding from a slightly more distant perspective for the first time. My father nodded once, slowly, without adding anything else, and in that single gesture I could sense that he had no further need to continue the discussion. The table remained still for a few moments longer, not because anything was unresolved, but because everyone seemed to be adjusting to the absence of further questions. I found myself reflecting on how quickly certainty had shifted throughout the evening, not through confrontation, but through simple clarification and the removal of assumptions that had never been directly tested. Olivia finally leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression calm now, no longer defensive, no longer certain, but thoughtful in a way that suggested she was processing something internally rather than externally. And as the evening settled into its final quiet state, I realized that nothing about the conversation had been about proving anyone right or wrong, but about exposing how easily human understanding can form complete conclusions from incomplete foundations, and how quickly those conclusions can change when they are asked to stand without repetition or assumption to support them. The final stretch of silence at the table did not feel like emptiness anymore. It felt like closure in its most subtle form, as if nothing further needed to be added because everything important had already been revealed through the structure of the evening itself. Olivia remained seated for a moment longer, her posture calmer now, no longer shaped by the need to explain or defend anything, but instead by a quiet awareness that something in her understanding had shifted without confrontation or conflict. My mother finally relaxed slightly in her chair, the tension in her expression easing as she realized the intensity of the conversation had passed without escalation, though the meaning of it all still lingered in her eyes. My father, however, simply placed his hands together on the table, not in emphasis or conclusion, but in a gesture of completion, as if the purpose of the entire exchange had reached its natural end point without requiring any declaration. He looked at Olivia one last time and said calmly that most people do not see reality directly. They see layers of interpretation built over time, and that clarity only appears when those layers are gently removed rather than argued against. There was no response needed to that statement, because it was not an invitation for agreement, it was simply an observation left resting in the space between us. Olivia nodded slightly, not in agreement or disagreement, but in acknowledgement, and in that small movement I could sense that she had begun to separate what she believed from what she could actually confirm. No one spoke after that, and the silence that followed no longer felt tense, only settled, like something that had naturally come to rest after being fully examined. My father eventually stood from the table without urgency, signaling the quiet transition from conversation to departure, and that movement alone seemed to release the remaining weight from the room. My mother followed shortly after, gathering herself with a sense of relief that was subtle but visible, as if she was stepping out of a space that had required more attention than expected. Olivia remained seated for a few seconds longer, her eyes focused somewhere between the table and her thoughts, as if replaying everything that had been said not to find answers, but to understand the shape of how she had arrived at her earlier certainty. I stayed where I was for a moment as well, observing not the outcome of the conversation, but the way perception itself had shifted gradually without resistance. There was no dramatic resolution, no confrontation, no correction, only a quiet recalibration of understanding that had taken place through questions that never needed to raise their voice. My father walked toward the hallway without looking back, his presence no longer carrying the weight of inquiry, but the stillness of conclusion. And in that final moment, I realized that nothing about the evening had been about exposing someone else, but about revealing how easily confidence can form when information is incomplete, how quickly admiration can fill the gaps left by absence, and how gently those assumptions can dissolve when they are finally asked to stand without repetition or reinforcement. As I sat there watching the room return to normal stillness, I understood that the most lasting impact of the evening was not any statement that had been made, but the quiet realization that clarity does not always arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives simply through the removal of everything that was never fully proven in the first place.